So in today's Elden Ring video, we'll take a look at 5 more amazing weapons that are even more powerful after the recent update changes. If you want the highest damage, change things around, or just try out new things, then I have just the stuff for you, so let's begin. Coming up to number 1, we have the Sacred Relic Sword, which had its Wave of Gold weapon art buffed in the new update, so that the FP cost and recovery times have been decreased. Meanwhile, the cast speed on the skill has been increased. The Wave of Gold skill is what made this the ultimate enemy farming tool, but that's not the only thing that makes this weapon good. In fact, the skill actually does a fair amount of damage, especially if you spec well enough into Faith. You can really hit anything from the other side of the room in any combat situation, but its main advantage is the fact that it also throws enemies on their back. Having the cast speed increased in the new update just means you can now spam this even more with following waves of gold before the targets even get a chance to properly wake up, assuming they're even alive to do so anymore. Its physical damage, on the other hand, isn't anything to speak of. Honestly, I don't think it's even something you're going to look for in this weapon anyway, and it's also a weapon that comes super late in the game. You have to pretty much give in the remembrance of the final boss in Elden Ring, point at which you're probably going to have much better options. Now, speaking of better options, there's actually one that comes a bit earlier, and that's going to be the Inseparable Sword. Its Sacred Blade skill had its cast speed increased in the new update, and it's definitely worth it. This was previously an excellent choice for Paladin players, and now you'll probably want it even more if you really enjoy that kind of playstyle. The Sacred Blade was never too OP or anything, but it gave a nice ranged holy damage that would also buff your own sword for additional holy damage. Its other great advantage is the fact that this can also one-shot undead enemies, with both the weapon hit and the holy projectile being able to completely remove the revive of the undead or skeleton enemies, which is one of the few weapons in the game that does so without being bugged. Oh, and by the way, it's also one of the strongest options against death right birds. If you really hate those bosses or their spammy attacks, this in just 3 hits can completely annihilate them. Now, to find this, you kinda have to be quite far into Fia's questline until she heads over to the Deep-Root Depths. You also need to get the Curse Mark of Death from the Divine Tower of Liurnia, which means you have to also progress through, well, Ranni's questline and do that part of the mission. On top of that, you also have to receive the Twinned Armor from Dee and then give it to his brother, which, by the way, you find in the balcony just as you make your way to the Gargoyle Duel boss in the Siofra Aqueduct. If everything goes right, you'll find him spawning next to Fia after you give her the Curse Mark and reset the Site of Grace, or if you're like me and progress too far in the main campaign before finishing this, you'll find both of their corpses and of course the items on the ground, including the sword right in front of you. Now, moving on to number 3, we have the Bolt of Gransax. Its Ancient Lightning Spear has also been buffed in the new update, so the FP cost has been reduced, the cast speed has been increased, and this now also allows the player to more easily withstand enemies' attacks while casting. This is a similar buff to the ones that we got for the other red lightning spells, but it's more suited for a dexterity user, having a pretty high requirement over there with absolutely no faith scaling on the weapon at all. Now, the main advantage of the bolt is the fact that, well, it's going to have a very long reach, probably even longer than, well, that wave of gold that we had on the previous weapon. The lightning spear also has some pretty great damage on it, even if you don't spec high into faith, so you can spam this from very far away before the enemies even reach you. It's also pretty much undodgeable, and now that it's much faster to cast, you can probably snipe a boss way before it can even react. But I also use it in a more defensive kind of playstyle. This is still a very long weapon, so using riposte after a shield block definitely does a great job at keeping enemies at bay and even completely stunning them. Now, to get this, you do need to defeat the Golden Shade of Godfrey in the royal capital and then head out the entrance to the left of the chamber. Following up the path down using this nearby elevator will eventually bring you to the nearby walls with a massive lance lodged by the side of it. You'll find the Bolt of Gransax near the end of the big lance, and it shouldn't be too difficult to reach it. Now, moving on to number 4, the next one, also a holy related weapon, is Marika. Marika's hammer. This is an alternate reward you can get from the Elden Beast Remembrance. If you either start a new game plus or just duplicate it, you can get both this and the previous wave of gold weapon. Now the gold breaker Ash of War on it has been buffed, so the FP cost and the recovery time have been decreased, and the cast speed has also been increased. The hammer was basically the same move that Marika uses during your encounter with them, including the follow-up AoE on the ground, which makes it really special. This has become literally one of my favorite weapons after the newest update, as you deal a ton of damage and it's also pretty satisfying to pull it off. Your initial charge up is extremely hard to interrupt, even by some of the strongest attacks. Once you're up in the air, you can actually fly for quite a long distance before reaching to your enemy, so that's also a nice gap closer. And once the final slam happens, you get to deal some serious damage and also send enemies up flying, which again I find quite satisfying. Having it on a faster cast and recovery time just adds to the flavor more, so that you can follow up with a second one after the first that pretty much stuns almost any enemy. And finally, the last one is going to be at number 5, the Grafted Dragon, the reward you get from exchanging the remembrance of the Grafted after defeating Godric early on in Elden Ring. Its Bear Witness had only one buff, which is an increase to cast speed, but even though the patch notes don't specify how much that cast speed has been buffed by, it's a pretty significant, and now it makes the weapon a totally viable option even much later in the game. This is what I ran on with a Faith/Strength hybrid with 40 points into each, so that I can get the best of both worlds, so both weapon damage and also quite a bit of Faith for that additional fire damage on top. But you can probably just spec outright into Strength and have the minimum into Faith to be able to use it. The starting wind-up is again another bow down by your character, which makes it great at also dodging incoming attacks, and then once you unleash it, it deals a massive explosion followed by a flaming rock sort of fall down that deals extra damage and also sets the ground on fire. If everything goes right and you can line up all of these shots, this makes up for some extremely high damage, especially against enemies that have low resistances to fire. Even if you don't use it like that, you can probably just use the physical component on it. This is still a fist weapon, which means you can just use it very fast, maybe even dual wield it and have some pretty great physical attack on it if you happen to not have any FP after casting the first ones. Anyway, this is pretty much it with all of the weapons after the new update. Totally let me know down below in the comments which one of these are you using the most, or do you have any other favorites. As always, if you enjoyed this video at any point, a thumbs up on it would be greatly appreciated, and if you really enjoyed it, also make sure you subscribe and activate that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next one.